I'm Susan Durber. I'm a minister in the United Reformed Church in the United Kingdom, and I presently serve as the WCC President from Europe. So the World Council of Churches is a fellowship of 356 member churches from every continent, from many different confessions. We have the aim of calling one another to visible unity. We hope to heal some of the ancient divisions of the church, but also to work together in service of Christ in the world. So it's a very exciting gathering. It's one where painful histories are faced, where we look forward to serving Christ together. It's always extraordinary to meet Christians from all over the world, of many different confessions, many different styles of Christianity. I went to the 5th World Conference, which took place 32 years ago in Spain. What struck me so much is the difference between them. So in this conference we have a much broader representation from around the world. So there are more people here from Africa, not so many from Latin America, which is regrettable, but lots of people from Asia, and of course North America and Europe. That in itself is striking, to see how Christianity has shifted in power and in numerical support from the global north to the global south. It's a very different world, and the things that we're discussing have changed. So we're still discussing the things that we have talked about for nearly a century now. Things like how to bring our churches together to heal some of the divisions, like whether we have bishops or not, that kind of thing, what we agree about communion, how we make decisions in our churches. But also now we're really thinking about issues like decolonialism, how to remake the world after the many shifts that there have been in geopolitics. We're talking about those who are hungry, those who are at war, and how the church can be a witness to bring healing and hope to so many people in the world. I've heard extraordinary and wonderful things inviting us to hope in places where I thought perhaps that hope was gone. It's been amazing to hear from Christians, for example, in the Middle East, where we are now, in Egypt. At the moment, there's a fragile ceasefire in Gaza, but there are many, many problems that the Middle East faces, not least the search for a lasting peace. But to see people with confident, lively faith serving their communities in settings where wars are happening, where there are such fragile communities, it is hugely encouraging. I hope that there might be a real shift somewhere. We've got to a place where we thought that unity would be about churches uniting together, becoming the united church of wherever, but the appetite for that is not somehow there. But there is a lot of appetite for working together, and there's a lot of longing for many different ways in which we can show our unity. So, for example, churches are working hard on building relationships with churches other than them so that they can share communion together, they can share ministry together, and share work together in the world. And sometimes that means working hard at dialogue, forming agreements, signing covenants, and really changing the way they work together. But sometimes it's about working together in social service, in bringing aid, in prophetic witness about things like climate change. And I can see that there are more of all of those sorts of things happening in the world. Perhaps the biggest thing we face at the moment as a global community is climate change. And that conversation is opening up between us in new ways. The World Council of Churches has called for a decade for climate justice. This is something so urgent that we cannot let our divisions and our differences prevent us from working together to address such a serious thing, which is affecting lives all over the world. We have churches represented here from the Pacific who are facing this threat daily, churches from parts of Asia where they're facing flooding caused by climate change, and many parts of the world where we're facing more storms and where people are dying because of poor atmosphere. So there are many ways in which we have to work together on that. And I think there is a sense of urgency about that, which we name together, we make plans together, and we talk about what it means in terms of our faith. And we rediscover that our faith, our Bible, our traditions, the early church fathers, and many of our churches hold resources for changing the way in which we think about the world. So the ecumenical movement started off thinking that this was about the unity of the church, and it is. And then we began to think about the unity of all people standing together in love, looking for peace. But now we also see that there's a sense in which God calls us to be in unity with creation, not dominating creation, not abusing and exploiting it, but also working with creation, recognizing that we are part of creation, and that when creation is growing, we have a duty, we're called by God to respond to that. I also think we'll have learnt a lot of new hymns, we'll have spent time praying together. We will all go away knowing more about the churches here in Egypt, and we will all have made a host of new friends all around the world. And that sense of connection is sometimes what begins to change the world. Well, we met quite a lot, and we had 3 groups, 3 sections working on all sorts of different things. So you have to imagine a group of about 60 people, Orthodox, Roman Catholic, Anglican, Methodist, Reformed, Quaker, Pentecostal, all sorts of traditions. 60 people working together for 8 years on 3 main things. So we had a group of us working on what it means to be the church, and are there any things that we can do so that in our understanding of the church we can work to bring churches together. And then we had a group working on what we called moral discernment. So we realised that many of the things that cause divisions in churches now are not necessarily the old theological debates about how is Christ present in the Eucharist, but are more things about ethics, about how we behave. And of course, the really big one is about sexuality. So we wanted to find a way of responding together to that kind of division in our churches, both between churches and within them. But it was too painful, too difficult to talk about sexuality itself, straight up. So we decided to look at the question of how is it that when churches have come to a new mind on some ethical matter, how has that happened? And how has it been agreed? What was it that enabled a church community to rediscover what it meant to follow Christ in relation to a certain issue? So we had all sorts of case studies about things like how do we respond to when someone takes their own life by suicide. You know, there was a time when Christians would refuse to bury such people in sacred ground. And one of our communities talked about how they had changed that practice and come to understand more about why people take their own lives, and took a more merciful approach and do indeed give them proper funerals. So that was one kind of issue. Another issue would be apartheid. At one time there were many Christians who, in some places, who thought apartheid was God's will. But now they don't think that. So how did it happen that they changed? All sorts of things like the witness of the wider world church, a new look at the Bible, those sorts of things. So there are all these different case studies trying to explore how it is that Christians rediscover or make a different move around particular ethical issues. So we try to take the heat out of the most pressing issue at the moment, and instead to talk about issues that can be recalled and reflected on. So that was the second group. Then the third group was saying, well, instead of looking at our divisions, let's ask what we can say together about some of the pressing issues of our times. And that group, for example, said, well, the most pressing issue of our time, as I've mentioned already, is ecological change, climate change, and ecological justice, the need for it. What can we say theologically together about that? And we wrote a small booklet called Cultivate and Care, and that brought together insights from all our traditions. And it was extraordinary for Protestants to learn from the Orthodox, who have always had a strong appreciation of the presence of God in creation. And for all of us to learn from one another about how we might then respond to creation. Those of us perhaps in the West, where the Industrial Revolution started, to think again about the theological framework that enabled us to think of creation as something we could exploit, and to reframe that in terms of a new relationship with creation. So there were these three different study groups, about 20 people in each one, and we would work separately in those groups and then come back together in the large gathering to compare our work, to reflect on it, to help each other, and so on. And we had the last year or so of the time of our commission was, of course, the time of COVID, which was the time when we were trying to write up the work over the years. So that meant we could get on with that in that extra time. So we also, of course, visited many places as we met, and we got to know the churches there and learnt about them. And we brought in consultants, people who were experts in the various things we were discussing. And of course, we made some really deep relationships and friendships between us, which of course makes the work so much more interesting and so much more possible. One of our big gatherings was to Nanjing in China, and that was a great privilege to be there, to visit the seminary in Nanjing, to visit the Amity Foundation, to receive copies of Bibles printed there. That was a great gift. And to experience something of life in the churches in China. That was a huge gift, and we're very grateful for that. Yes, I started out very young, going to Santiago de Compostela to the last Faith and Order World Conference. And I remember when I went, I didn't know what to make of it, really. People were arguing about things I wasn't sure I knew what they were arguing about. People were saying things in a theological language that I found very strange. This wasn't like the church I knew at home. And the things I took for granted, other people didn't. So I think my first instinct was to say, right, well, I must defend what I've come with and make sure that my voice is heard, or voices like mine, and kind of try and push the process and the decisions in a way that seemed to be right to me. But over the years, I think I have been humbled and recognised that it's much more important, certainly for as long as you can, to listen and to learn from others. So I now experience unity not as an attempt to make people like me, but as a process of receiving gifts from others, as well as offering what gifts I hope I can. So let's see if I can think of an example. Well, there was a time when I was not at all interested in the early church. I was interested in the Bible and interested in the church today, but not really much in the middle. I thought that was history and gone. But I learned from many of my Orthodox friends that the early church is a living community. The saints, they're not dead, they're not bones. They are a living community, and their teachings, their wisdom can become part of my life too. So I feel a greater sense of unity now with the church throughout time, as well as the church across the space of the globe. And I see unity not now as everyone becoming like me, nor me becoming like one part of them, but us walking beside one another on a pilgrimage together towards the church that God is creating. I'm happier with diversity, but also longing for friendship, to learn from one another, for us to exchange gifts, and for us to be accountable to one another, because I recognise that Christ is present in the face of every one of those that I meet. So I need to look for him there. I remember a time when, early in my time at Faith and Order, when there was a bishop with whom I disagreed quite a lot, and he disagreed with me, and we were quite touchy with each other, not easy, and we had an argument on the floor, and I felt uneasy about it. He came from a very different part of the church from me. He was quite a strong, forceful character, but I realised that underneath that, he was a very faithful, very clever, very devout person. So we were about to go to a Sunday service during this meeting together, and I said to him as we got out of the coach to go into this monastery, I said, I can't go to worship without restoring our fellowship, without being at peace. And he was so lovely and clearly felt that this was the right thing too. So we shared the peace with one another, and our relationship was much better after that. And we listened to each other. And he really admired the way that I was willing to say in public that I had changed my mind about some things, and that I had learned from other traditions. And when it came to electing a new moderator for Faith and Order, he was one of those who suggested it should be me, which I would never have predicted from our first encounter. So that was a kind of wonderful miracle, and we're still in touch, and I treasure that memory. Yeah, there are many, many other stories I could tell, I'm sure. I remember wrestling with jet lag on so many occasions and having to give a talk when I was feeling wretchedly tired, but somehow God's Spirit gives you the energy to do it. I can remember people on the commission leaving or dying and feeling sorrow about that. I can remember in our work a wonderful moment where we finished work on a document called The Church Towards a Common Vision. This was a text that had been 20 years in the making, with lots of consultation, lots of sending it out to the churches for their responses, drafts and redrafts. And then came a moment, we were in Malaysia, in the basement of a hotel, and we put the final full stop, and we realised this was the final version. And we paused, and then we all sang together Laudate Dominum, for a song from the Teze community. And it was a beautiful, faithful moment, which really showed that we're not an academic commission, not just a bunch of people trying to agree a text, but people seeking the mind of Christ together and really trying to produce something to serve the church. So that's just a few memories. One day I'll write my memoirs perhaps, and there'll be more. Serve as the president from Europe, and I live in Europe, about almost as far west as you can go in Europe, at the west of Wales in Britain. So the churches in Europe face several different kinds of challenges. One of them is what you might describe as increasing secularization, so that in many countries in Europe, perhaps not quite all, but in many, as you do surveys of religious belief, you find fewer and fewer people claiming that they have a religious faith. And we've got to the point, I think, in Britain, where more people say they have no faith than those who have some faith. And church attendance has gone down very fast in many places, and COVID has accelerated that. So that's one of the challenges that we face in a continent where most people used to have a nominal Christian faith at least, where many monarchs and state rulers have been Christian. Now we're becoming a minority. And in some ways that's not entirely negative, because it means that people are not coming to church because it's socially the thing to do. They're coming to church because they really believe it and they're committed. But there's a challenge in handing on the faith to the next generations, and how to make Christianity appealing and attractive and resonate with people in Europe today. So that is a challenge. There have also been challenges in terms of scandals, sexual abuse, financial scandals, that kind of thing, that's made people feel in some places not simply not really bothered about the church, but actually positively anti the church. And that's another challenge that we face, to help people to understand how the church can be reformed, can respond to those challenges, can put its house in order and become a place that can be trusted again. There's also the challenge, well, it's not only a challenge, but it's also a joy, that there are many people from around the world who come into Europe to live in Europe who have a Christian faith. So you will find in many cities in Europe lots of churches that are mainly made up of migrants or people whose parents were migrants. The challenge is then to promote unity with those churches, to make sure they feel welcome in ecumenical gatherings or in the churches that are already there, and to listen to them and to respond to their faith, to be encouraged by their faith, and to recognise that global Christianity doesn't need you to take a plane these days in Europe. You can find it around the corner. So Christians in Europe face all the challenges that people in Europe face. So there are challenges about possible threats from outside Europe, military threats, and the withdrawal of the US's support in some ways. There are challenges in deindustrialization, so that there are fewer jobs in some ways. I think AI is adding to that. So that there are some people who have lots of money and some people who have very little work and not much hope for the future, which has led in some places to the rise of more right-wing political protest movements. So there's a challenge, I suppose you might call it, of inequality, that Europe is a place of rich heritage and rich resources, but they're not equally shared. And also the manufacturing jobs tend to be outsourced, places like China, for example, so that there aren't perhaps jobs for everyone who needs them. So Europe is not entirely a comfortable place. It's a place in transition. Not everyone is happy about the amount of migration to Europe, but I hope that many in the churches are encouraged in many ways to see diversity in Europe and to welcome people from all over the globe. In a sense, there isn't a WCC Europe. There is an organisation called the Conference of European Churches, which is not part of the structure of the WCC. It's another organisation, but it brings together many of the churches in Europe, though not the Roman Catholic Church, which has its own organisation. But the WCC works closely with the Conference for European Churches. We do things together. We prepared for this World Conference together, and I'm really hoping that we'll be able to work together much more in the future. So, as a WCC president, it's not my role in a sense to lead European Christians, but my role is to represent the WCC to Christians in Europe and the other way around, and to participate anywhere in Europe where I can see Christians coming together, seeking unity. I would say, may God bless you richly, and may you find in each other and in your churches the peace and justice of God. And I know that in China you have a very different form of ecumenism from us. We've moved beyond the denominations that have dominated European church life to find a different kind of unity. And I think you can be a model for us. Perhaps you are showing us a kind of future. And I know too that you live and practice faith in a very different context from Europe. And I pray that you will be given grace to do that faithfully and with courage. Yeah, I've learned so much from the Christians in China, and I would love to come again one day in order to learn more. When I was confirmed, when I confessed my own faith for the first time, I was given a gift of a book, and it was a book called The Small Woman. But this was a book about a missionary called Gladys Aylward, who went to China, and she was an extraordinary missionary. She really broke the mold of mission, because she actually became Chinese. She surrendered her British passport and became Chinese. She wore Chinese clothes. She spoke of the gospel in ways that could resonate in Chinese culture. And she had this extraordinary story of rescuing children during when Japanese forces were bombing and invading China. And that story has stayed with me as a great inspiration. So she was someone who did great things, even though she was very small, inexperienced. The way in which she kind of gave up her own identity or part of it in order to assume that of another culture in a way that was about giving to them, was sacrificial, I think was amazing.